So today we're going to be talking all about how to shoot in manual. So quick introduction before I get started. If you don't know who I am, my name is Stephen Lee, and I've been doing photography full time now for 9 years, and then doing photography itself, including doing it for fun and as a hobby for maybe 15, 20 years, I would say. So yeah, I've been doing it for a long time. I'm based out of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, so I'm a Canadian. I have two companies that I run. So I have my service company, which is Stephen Lee Studios, and I basically provide photography services to businesses, so commercial photography. So I do things like headshots, business portraits, real estate, food photography, product photography, and then also content for social media. I also do video. So I do a lot of like business promo videos, YouTube videos, quick little 5-10 second little ads to promote a business with lots of like animation and motion graphics. And then I have my other business, which is called Unstoppable Photographers. That's the actually education side where I teach photography basically. So that's kind of where this course is under actually Unstoppable Photographers. So I will teach things on teaching people how to be better at photography. So things like camera basics, like just how to use your camera, composition, all the way to editing, like using Lightroom, Photoshop, and then more advanced stuff like portraits, studio lighting, that type of thing. And I also love business. And I love talking about business because I've been running it for 9 years. So I also have two programs, I guess courses and memberships that I run to help people with the business side of things if they are interested in learning how to make money doing photography. I'll have something called Unstoppable Photographers Launch, where I help a photographer launch their business from scratch in 9 weeks. So from zero to launching their business in 9 weeks. And then Unstoppable Photographers Pro, where I teach a lot of the marketing and sales and how to get clients basically, is what I teach on that side. And yeah, and I have a lot of lessons for those that were in those courses where I teach like marketing, Instagram, how to do mini sessions, get clients through LinkedIn, Facebook, figuring out pricing, all that fun stuff. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Okay, so let's get started to the training today. So like I said, welcome everyone to today's class. I'm going to be teaching you all about how to shoot in manual. So the agenda for today, we're going to cover all of this. So we're going to start with your camera dial and understanding that and what all the letters and symbols mean. Then we're going to talk about the big three, like I said. So we're going to talk about ISO, we're going to talk about shutter speed, and then we're going to talk about aperture. And then we're going to put it all together and talk about the exposure triangle, and then how to shoot in semi-auto, and then finally how to shoot in manual. So step one, your camera dial. So most camera dials look something like this. The only real exception is if you have a very unique Fuji out there. I know there's a Fuji that's out there that simulates like a very old school kind of camera, and they have a dial for aperture, a dial for shutter, and a dial for ISO, and the actual values are on there. But if you don't have that very unique version of the Fuji, most cameras kind of look like this, like the dials, with like maybe a couple extra words or letters or symbols. Okay, so the first thing that most photographers will shoot in is something called auto, right? That's kind of the basics. When you're just getting started, you just set it to auto. So normally it's a green symbol. It might say auto on it. And then you'll have another one that has a flash symbol with a line going through it. So the green one is auto, meaning you don't have control over anything. It does its own thing. It'll adjust the shutter, it'll adjust the aperture, it'll adjust the ISO. All you do is press the shutter button and shoot away. The auto with no flash is if you don't want the flash to pop up and to be turned on basically when you're shooting, then you would switch it to auto no flash. So basically you would probably want to do that when you don't want the flash. For example, like if you're in a museum, they're like no flash photography, or you're in a public place and you don't want to be annoying the people around you with the flash, or you just don't want the flash to be turned on, right? Because you don't like how it looks, or it kind of creates an overexposed look, or or whatever the reason is you don't want the flash, right? So that's the kind of the starting point for most people when they first buy their camera, is they set it to auto or auto no flash. Then there's something called scene modes. So scene modes, either you can see the symbols, kind of like the ones you see here, or else it'll say the word scene, and then you have to go to the back of the camera, like the display, and switch through the different scene modes, basically. So what the scene modes are is it's still auto, actually, but it's auto with a bias towards that specific situation. Okay, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So for example, one of the most common scene modes is portrait, right? So it's like that lady in the hat. So with portrait, as the camera knows, like, okay, you're shooting a person. So probably you want to have a kind of a blurry background. So when you set it to portrait mode, right, it will try to make the background blurry. But it's still going to adjust all the different settings and just will crank the aperture to a very low number to create a blurry background. If you're shooting, let's say, night portraits, then it's like, okay, we need to pop up the flash, right? Because it's going to be dark and we need to light the subject. If you're shooting landscape, right, you switch it to landscape mode, then it knows, okay, we don't want to blur out the background, right? You don't want to, let's say you're shooting some mountains, we don't want to blur out the background. So then it's going to increase your aperture to a large number so that everything's in focus, right? Or you're shooting sports, right? Sports mode, then it needs to crank up the shutter speed and make sure it's fast, because there's things that are moving very fast and it's going to try to freeze motion. So that's what the scene modes are. It's auto, but with a bias towards that situation, and I'll optimize the setting for that situation. Then you got semi-auto. Depending on if you have Nikon or Canon or Sony or Fuji, I guess. I know for Nikon, it's AS&P. For Canon, they call it AV, TV, and P, okay? And these are your semi-autos, okay? Meaning it lets you control one or two of the settings, but some of the other settings will still be on automatic, okay? So A or AV, so it basically will let you control one of the big three, basically, okay? So with A or AV, it will actually let you control aperture, okay? You control aperture, so on your cameras, you'll have either a front dial or a back dial, and if you turn that dial, it will adjust the aperture. The aperture is like that F number, so like F 3.5, F8, F11, F4.5, it's that F number, okay? So it will let you control the aperture. You just adjust it by turning the dial, either the front dial or the back dial, and it will adjust the shutter speed for you. ISO will either be manual, meaning you manually control it and adjust it, or you can set it to auto ISO and then it'll adjust it on its own too. If you switch it to S or TV, that's called shutter priority. So now you control the shutter, okay? So on a camera, the shutter is measured in seconds. So a lot of times on your camera, it'll be fractions of a second, like 1/200, 1/60, 1/125, 1/10, or it's a full second, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And so now you get to control the shutter. So you turn that front dial or back dial, the shutter speed will adjust, and it will adjust the aperture for you this time. Okay. And then P is called, I believe it's called program mode or program something. I forgot exactly. And depending on the camera, it does different things. Some cameras, it will let you play with ISO and play with white balance. Others, it's kind of like a hybrid between aperture and shutter, meaning because you have two dials, right? If you turn one dial, it will adjust the shutter and then aperture will change on its own. And if you turn the front dial, the shutter will change and then aperture will change on its own, right? So different cameras it'll do different things. But it'll be usually one of those two, okay? Lastly, you got manual. So with manual, you fully have control over aperture, you have full control over shutter or shutter speed. And then ISO, it depends on what you set it to. If you set it to auto ISO, it'll adjust on its own. If you have it set to manual ISO, then again, you have control over ISO. If you don't know what aperture, shutter, and ISO means, don't worry, we're going to get more in depth about that in a second here. Yes, so manual, you have full control over aperture, and then you full control over shutter, and then ISO depends on what you set it to, if it's manual or auto. Other things you might see on the dial. I'm going to talk about 4 things. There might be more than these 4, but these are the kind of 4 that I've come across quite often. Sometimes some cameras will have something called effects. Effects are like filters. And they only work when you're shooting in JPEG because it's going to add a filter to your photo. Okay, kind of like Instagram filters, right? And depending on what effect you pick, it'll do different things. Some very common effect is black and white. High key, low key, meaning making an image very bright or very dark. Silhouette. What else have I seen? I'm trying to remember here. Oh, selective color, meaning like one color, you can see one color, and then everything else is black and white, right? For example, whatever is red in the image is actually red, and then everything else is black and white. So yeah, so there's different effects you can do, but yeah, again, it's kind of like, you know, social media filters, Instagram filters, things like that, but it's in camera. Sometimes you'll see something called Creative Auto or CA, it'll say on the camera. And with CA, it's kind of like P mode, where it lets you play with 1 or 2 settings on your camera. And what I've seen with CA is a lot of times it'll say, do you want the background to be blurry or in focus, right? And you just move the slider left or right. And sometimes it'll let you play with white balance. And sometimes it'll let you play with ISO. So again, it depends on the camera and what it lets you kind of do. User presets. So either it'll say C1, C2. Sometimes I've seen C1, C2. That might be a Canon thing, maybe. But user presets just means whatever you set your camera to, right? It will save it to those settings, right? Like if you adjust, okay, am I going to shoot in RAW or JPEG? Is my white balance a certain value? Is my image quality a certain value? Whatever you set your camera settings to, it will remember it. So then if you go to U1 and then make other changes, it will remember it. And then if you go U2 and then you can make more changes. And then so then now you can switch from U1 to U2, right? For example, I know a photographer where they're shooting weddings and they basically set U1 for indoor and U2 for outdoor. So when somebody's walking from inside to outside, so for example, the bride or the groom, right? Let's say the ceremony's over, they're inside and they're walking outside towards the outside of the church. They'll shoot U1 while they're inside the church. And then as they walk through that door and go outside, they'll switch to U2 so that they don't have to fill out all the settings, right? And then they'll shoot on U2 for outdoors as an example of how you would use that. And then some cameras will have something called ADEEP, which stands for automatic depth. So that's where you basically tell the camera, okay, do I want the background more blurry or I want the background more in focus? You basically pick that setting and then it will adjust the settings, which is basically aperture, to make your background more blurry or more in focus. So that's kind of what that is. Any questions about that? Or does anybody have something on their dial that like, oh, I have this on my dial. What does it do? I might be able to help you depending on what it is. Okay, if not, I'm going to move on. Okay, so we'll get into the good stuff now. We're going to talk about the big 3. So aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Like I said, if you can understand these 3 things, you will and know how to put them together, right? Kind of make them work together and understand the relationship between the three, you will know how to shoot in manual. So I'm going to start with the easier, one of the easiest ones to understand, and then I'll progressively get harder and harder. Okay. So I'm going to start with ISO. It's one of the easiest ones to understand. Okay. So what exactly is ISO? What do I mean by ISO? ISO is how sensitive the sensor is to light. Okay. So the higher the number, the more sensitive it is to light, which also means the brighter your image is going to be. Okay. So normally your ISO, it's that number on your camera where it's like, it usually starts at 100 and then it keeps doubling. So 100, 200, 400, 8, 16, 3200, 6400. So if you see that number on either the back of your camera or the top of your camera, that's your ISO. Okay. And then, like I said, as the number goes up, your sensor will be more sensitive to light. Okay. So ISO affects your image in two ways. The first one is exposure, right? So we kind of talked about that. As the ISO goes up, your image will get brighter. The second way it affects your image is noise. Sometimes people call it grain, or how grainy an image is. Okay, that's like sometimes when you see like very old photos or very dark photos, you'll usually see the noise. And it's like little specks of like blue, red, green on the photo, okay? And again, with noise, the higher your ISO, the more noisier your image is gonna be, which is generally not a good thing, unless you're trying to make it look kind of vintagey, kind of old, and it's intentional. Okay, so here's an example. So I took these three photos at different ISOs, but all my other settings were the same, meaning my aperture and my shutter did not change. Okay, so I was shooting in manual. And I took three photos at three different ISOs. So you can see when I had a low ISO, so ISO 200, the image is dark. When I shot a 1600, the image is brighter, right? Properly exposed. And then if I shot a 6400, it's now overexposed, right? Kind of blown out. It's kind of hard to see what's on the cards, right? So you can see the relationship between exposure and ISO, right? Now, the second thing, like I said, ISO effects is noise. The larger your ISO, the noisier or grainier it's going to be. So you can see on the image on the very far right, you see how this candy cane, you can see a lot of little dust, like little specks, right? Specks of red and green and blue. It doesn't look pretty, right? It doesn't look sharp. It looks, so you don't want that, right? With noise, you want to keep it as low as you can and only bump up your ISO when you have to, right? It's like, I have no other options. I have to bump up my ISO just to get a properly exposed image, right? Because you don't want a super dark image, right? Okay, so any questions about ISO?
What settings do you recommend for daylight or for the evening time?
Like in all the settings or just ISO?
No, just ISO.
Or daylight and nighttime, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so it depends on how much light there is, but generally for daytime, like the sun's out, you can keep your ISO very low, so 100 basically. For nighttime, you will generally need to crank it up. And nighttime plus also indoors. Indoors is actually considered dark to the camera, even though eyes think it's bright. So for indoors with the lights on, you're probably going to shoot at like 1600. And then for like even darker, 3264. Yeah.
Okay. And for cloudy, say rainy weather, would it be around the same?
Again, it depends on your camera settings, like your other two settings, like your aperture and your shutter. But if you need a general rule of thumb, I would say maybe 800.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problems. As I mentioned, if you have questions, actually type in the chat box. Don't unmute yourself unless I say that's okay. Yeah, cool. So if anyone has any other questions, type in the chat box. Okay, so I did mention this class is actually interactive. So we're going to play around with your camera and actually test this out. So yeah, we're gonna have a little practice session. So this is what I want you to do. If you don't have your camera, go grab your camera. If you do have your camera, perfect. If you don't have access to a camera, then don't worry, just take a break, I guess. So I want you to set your camera to manual, which is M on your dial. Set the ISO to 6400, aperture to f3.5, and shutter of 1/16. So the settings are on the screen. So if you don't know or don't remember, it's on the screen. So the first four, right? And then I want you to find a random object around you. Maybe you have a cup right in front of you, or a toy, or a figurine, or some kind of object around you. And I want you to take a photo of it. If your image is overexposed, just bump down your ISO until it's properly exposed. So just crank it down a little bit. And then I want you to take another photo. After you've taken that photo, take another one at 1600, and then take another photo at 400. And then notice it either getting brighter or darker as you adjust your ISO. So that's kind of the purpose of this practice. So I'll give everybody about, yeah, two to 3 minutes to do this. If your camera doesn't go to 6400, then whatever the highest is on your camera. So if it's 3200, leave it at 3200. Okay, so Dana, do you have two dials? If you have two dials, like a front dial and a back dial, then one dial is for aperture and one dial is for shutter. If you don't have two dials, if you have one dial, then on the back of the camera, you'll see a button that says AV. You have to press the AV button and then turn the dial. How's it going for everybody? Are you seeing it getting brighter and darker, I guess? It should be darker if you're going down on it with your ISO. I see your question, Dana. I'm just looking it up. Okay, yours is a little different. Okay, so probably what I would do, Dana, I would hit the I button, the info button, and then change it on the back of the screen. You should see all your settings on the back of the screen. And I would go in there to change your aperture. Let's see here. Okay, cool. You got it. Awesome. Yeah, every camera is a little different. Oh. Okay, I feel like a lot of people have figured this out. If you don't, that's okay. You can always practice at the end or later, I guess. So we'll move on. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is shutter speed. Okay, what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is how fast or slow the shutter opens and closes, right? So when you take a photo, right, you'll hear that sound, right? Or right? When you hear, if you only hear one sound, which is it just means it's so fast. It's actually two sounds, but because your shutter speed is so fast, it sounds like it's only making one sound, right? So, but when you slow down the shutter speed, right, like make it maybe like 1/30, 1/15, even like 1/4, you will hear two distinct sounds. They'll go or right. But when you're shooting at like 1/125, 1/60, 1/250, it's super fast, right? Or right. So that's shutter speed. Just how fast or slow that shutter opens and closes to let in light into the camera. And shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. So on a camera, usually it's fractions of a second, like 1/125, 1/60, 1/250, 1/400. But if you're trying to do long exposure, then that's where you go into seconds, right? Like 1 second, 2 second, 4 seconds, 8 seconds. And that's when you see like a number with like two dashes next to it, right? Like one dash dot, like one quotation basically. That just means 1 second. Yeah, so like I said, on the back of camera, like for example, on this photo here, it's 1/200th of a second, right? But shutter speed is measured in seconds, so you can do 1 full second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. You can technically go for infinite seconds. There's a setting called bulb where you can actually manually press it to open and then press it again to close. And then you can do fractions of a second. So 160, 1/125, 1/400. Okay, so your shutter speed affects your image in two ways. One is exposure, and the second one is motion. Okay. And what I mean by motion is if there's things moving in your photo, is it fast? Sorry, is it sharp and focus or is it blurry? Okay. So that's what I mean by affecting motion. So here's an example of how shutter affects exposure. So again, in this situation, my camera's on manual. So my aperture and my ISO is fixed. It's not moving. Okay. And at 1/30th of a second, so right, it's letting in lots of light, so it's bright. And then 1/125 is a little faster, right, letting less light. And then super fast, 1/250, right, right, it's letting very little light, so it's darker. Okay, so we're gonna practice, and you're gonna see the relationship between shutter speed and exposure. Okay. So I want you to set your camera to manual again. Set your ISO to 3200, aperture at 3.5, shutter at 1/125. And then again, take a photo of a random object that's just around you. It's like a cup, whatever you have around you, pen, you know. And then if you take that initial photo and it's actually overexposed, then bump down your ISO again. Then I want you to take 2 more photos, one at 1/60th of a second, and then 1/15th of a second. And you'll notice the image getting brighter. So again, I'll give everybody a couple minutes to do this. And if you have any questions about how to change your shutter, I guess, let me know. What does SCLCHQ M up? So that's just on certain cameras, like that dial. Not all cameras have that dial. That's just your drive mode, meaning what happens when you press the shutter button. On other cameras, usually like 2 rectangles, I think, or something like that. And if you don't have that symbol on the back of your camera, then you have to go into the menu. So like the info button, and you have all the information on the screen to get there. But yeah, that's your drive mode, meaning when you press the shutter button, what happens, right? Default is you press the shutter button and it takes a photo. That's S, right? And then CLCH is continuous, like burst mode, right? It goes, right? And L is low and H is high. Q is quiet. And then M up means the mirror is flipped up to take the photo before you take the photo. Okay, awesome. Somebody says, yeah, they're getting brighter images as they bump down the shutter speed. Sure, Anna, you can text me a question. Okay, so we're going to move on. I feel like everybody was able to do this exercise. Okay, so as I mentioned, shutter speed affects your image in 2 ways, right? One was exposure, and you kind of got to practice that and kind of get a feel for that. The second is motion. So if something's moving, like this pinwheel, so in all 3 of these photos, the pinwheel was spinning. When I shoot it at a very low shutter, a slow shutter speed, you can see that it captures all the movement of the pinwheel, and it creates a kind of blur pinwheel effect, right? Then as I increase the shutter speed and make it faster, it starts to freeze motion, right? You can see on the 3rd photo at 1/400th of a second, it almost looks like it's not spinning at all, right? You can kind of notice the edges are still a little bit blurry and there is a little bit of motion, but it's almost frozen, right? So as you make your shutter speed faster and faster and you're shooting something that's moving, you're able to freeze motion. So if you're shooting anything fast, right, like sports, like hockey, dance, um, football, baseball, dogs running, kids running, or people doing track and field, right? And you want to freeze motion, then you want to shoot at a very fast shutter speed, right? Or you're capturing something flying away, like a bird flying in the air, right? You also need a fast shutter speed. Okay, so now we're going to practice, and you're going to see the relationship between motion and shutter speed. Okay, so for this next exercise, camera on manual again. ISO is 3200. Aperture is 3.5. Shutter is 1/125th of a second. And then I want you to put an object in front of the camera, about at least a feet away from the camera, like whatever distance it needs to be for it to focus. So 1 to 2 feet away. And then I want you to wave that object in front of the camera. Either it's an object that you have around you, like a cup again or whatever, or you can just wave your hand. You can use your hand to wave, okay? Whatever you got to do. Take that initial photo, and then if it's too bright, bump down your ISO. And then I want you to shoot 2 more times while that object is moving. Either it's your hand or an object that you're moving in front of the camera. And shoot it at 1/60 and then 1/15. And you should notice the motion getting blurrier. Okay. Yeah. The progression of your object getting blurrier and blurrier. Let me know. Type in the chat. Okay, Mary says she was able to do it. Awesome. Olivia says she was able to do it. Awesome. Nicola was able to do it too. Awesome. Same with Brittany. Same with Adeline. Okay, so someone asked what kind of lens should I have? I would say just a good a good wideish zoom lens would be good, or anything between 20 to 50 millimeter. So don't use a telephoto lens. That should have been something I should have mentioned at the beginning. Thanks for asking. Yeah, don't use a telephoto. Telephoto means like a super zoom lens. Use something between 20 to 50. Yeah, 18 to 55 is perfect. Okay, no worries. Yeah, if you have a telephoto lens, switch to a wider lens. Okay, so I feel like everyone, or at least many of you, have done this exercise. So I'm gonna move on. If you need more time, just let me know, and I can always wait another minute or two. Okay, I'll move on if there's no objection. Okay, so another thing that's kind of related to shutter speed that's kind of really important for everyone to understand is something called camera shake. And what I mean by camera shake is camera shake from your hand or from handheld. Because when you're holding your camera with your hand is not perfectly still, right? Your hand's not a tripod, you're not a robot, and you can keep your hand perfectly still, right? There's going to be micro movements or vibrations from holding it with your hand, right? So you want to make sure that you don't have your shutter speed so low that it starts to cause blur in your photo because of being handheld, okay, and the shake from your hand. So there's two ways to combat camera shake from your hands, okay? There's something called vibration reduction, which some lenses have, okay? And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then the other thing you can do is making sure that you shoot at a fast shutter speed or a shutter speed that's good for handheld. That won't cause shake, okay? Or you won't be able to see the shake from your hand. So with some cameras, with some lenses, not all lenses, you'll see something that says VR on the lens itself, and it's a little. Sometimes it should have a switch on there that says on and off, right? VR. Some cameras call it something else. Sometimes they'll call it IS, which is image stabilization. And I think there's another one out there. But yeah, if it says VR, IS, image stabilization, vibration reduction. I know there's another one out there. They call it something. Oh, OS, that's the other one. Optical stabilization. That all kind of means the same thing. Just different brands. They just want to call it something different, so they're different from their competition, basically. But it all does the same thing. And what it does is it helps reduce and compensate for that vibration from your hand, basically, the shake from your hand. Okay. So it's going to help. It's not like amazing, meaning like you can have major movement with the camera and it'll reduce the blur. It's more for like micro movements. Okay. So yeah, make sure that's on if you're hand holding your camera. And then the second thing to be aware of is making sure that you're shooting at a fast enough shutter speed for handheld. Okay. So then you might ask the question, okay, what is considered fast enough shutter speed? The rule of thumb is your minimum shutter speed for handheld should be 1/f. F is the focal length that you're shooting at, okay? So I'll give you two examples. If you're shooting at 60 millimeter, then your minimum shutter speed should be 1/60. If you're shooting with a 200mm lens, then your minimum shutter speed should be 1/200. Okay, so it really depends on your lens. The wider the lens, the slower you can get away with without causing blur from camera shake from your hand. The more telephoto your lens is, or more zoomed in your lens is, the faster it will need to be to compensate. So this is really important, especially if you're shooting indoors and you're like, why is all my photos blurry, right? This may be one of the reasons. Or you're shooting at nighttime. Okay, so another fun effect, I guess, you can do with once you're starting to learn how to manipulate shutter speed, is doing something called long exposure. So a very long exposure, basically all that means is you're shooting at a very, you're having the shutter be open for a long period of time, right? So we're talking about like half second, 1 second, 2 seconds. That's called long exposure. And so normally when you're shooting with long exposure, because remember we talked about minimum shutter speed, right? For handheld, it's normally in fractions of a second. But if for long exposure, normally it's in full seconds. So you actually need a tripod or something very stable to do long exposure. You can't do, not you can't, but it's very hard to do long exposure handheld, okay? So if you ever seen stuff like this, right, where you get that kind of smooth, silky effect when you're shooting moving water, like waterfalls or a stream, that's from long exposure. I'm pretty sure this photos was taken at either like a half of a second or 1 second, I believe. This photo with all the car trails, right, the headlights and taillights, was shot at around, I believe, around 10 seconds. So long enough for the car to go from enter the frame and then leave the frame. So yeah, once you get very creative and get comfortable with shooting a manual and doing long exposure, you can do stuff like this. Well, guess what? We're going to play around with some long exposures. Okay, so for this exercise, all you need is a camera, a phone actually. If you have a flashlight, that's even better. But if you don't have a flashlight nearby, you can just use your phone and turn on the flashlight mode on your phone. Okay. So what you do, yeah, have your phone. So step one, you need your camera to be stable. So either just leave it on your table, or if you have a tripod nearby, you can definitely use a tripod, but you can just leave it on your table. And then, yeah, make sure you're indoors, which most of you are. Set it to manual. Set your ISO to 200. Set your aperture to f11. And then set your shutter speed to 2 seconds. If your exposure is either too bright or too dark, you can always adjust your ISO or adjust your aperture. Then when it's open and you're taking a photo for 2 full seconds, wave your flashlight. Either it's your actual flashlight or it's the flashlight mode on your cell phone, and wave it in front of a camera. Make a shape like a circle or a star, or try to spell out a name like the initials of your first name and last name or something like that. Or just whatever, maybe start with a circle first and then you can get more creative afterwards once you get comfortable. And yeah, and see what happens. So yeah, type in the chat box if you're able to create a long exposure, like a circle or some kind of shape. Of a second, right? For this exercise, you need to keep turning the dial until that number goes to 2. And it should be 2 and then quotations, or 2 dash dash. That's 2 seconds. Not 1/2. 1/2 is half a second. to do it. Olivia, Dana, Brittany was able to do it. Awesome. Yeah, so basically what's happening is, if you're curious, okay, how does this work or what's going on? When you have it open for 2 seconds or however long it is that you have it, it's capturing any light that the sensor is being exposed to, right? In that 2 seconds in this case, right? So if you're moving your light around within that 2 seconds, and it captures that entire movement, right? If you have something else moving within that 2 seconds, right? It's going to capture everything in that 2 seconds, right? So that's what's happening. It's not voodoo magic or anything. It's just camera magic. Yeah. Was anyone else successful? Mary was able to. Awesome. Anybody needs help? Uh, Not faster, but slower. Yeah, so the slower the shutter speed, the more time you'll have to do whatever you want it to do, right? So if you switch it to 4 seconds, then you've got 4 seconds to draw light. It's called light painting, what you're doing, to light paint your image or your whatever you want, right? Yeah. But if you set it to, let's say, half second, then you only have half a second to draw something, right? Yeah. So if you, a lot of times I've seen people do like full on so-called like art or a full canvas image, like a full image with light painting, right? Or they're trying to spell out somebody's name or a letter, a word or something, right? Like love or um, Edmonton or their full name or something, right? Then yeah, you need like 5 to 10 seconds probably to spell out a complete name, right? Okay, so if no one needs more time, if you do, just let me know. But if not, then I guess I'll move on. And yeah, definitely if this is something that piques your interest, a lot of times it's done with 2 people. You'll have one person managing the camera and a second person doing the paint, like the light painting. Or what you could do is you can set your camera on a tripod and then do a time delay, like a 2-second delay. So then it gives you time to run in front of the camera and then draw whatever you want to draw with your flashlight. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's move on. Okay, the next thing. So last of the big 3 that we're going to talk about is aperture. This is the more complicated of the 3, so that's why I left it to the very last or to the very end. Okay, so aperture. What is aperture? Aperture is the size of the hole that you're shooting through. So if you see that image on the left, right, that opening there, your camera can actually adjust that, make it smaller or make it bigger with the blades, right? And basically that's what aperture is. Like when you're playing with your aperture, which is that F number, it will make that hole bigger or smaller. Okay. So yeah. So the size of your aperture is relative to your focal length. That's why it's not just a number, it's like F something, right? So f1.8, f4, f11. The F stands for focal length. Okay. So, and this is where it gets confusing, especially if you're new to Aperture. I know I got very confused about this when I was learning, well, just a beginner. So it's the smaller the F number, the bigger the aperture. The bigger the F number, the smaller the aperture. It's actually inverted. Okay. The reason why it's inverted is when someone says F and then a number like F11 or F5.6, what does that actually mean? It actually means this. You're dividing. So F5.6 is actually F divided by 5.6. And F11 is actually F divided by 11. So when you divide by a bigger number, you end up with something small, right? Easiest way to understand that is think of like pizza, okay? You have a pizza, a full pizza, right? And you cut it in half, right? So F divided by 2. Well, that piece of pizza is still pretty big. Let's divide it by 4. So F4, right? You divide that pizza by 4. Okay, it's a decent sized pizza, a piece still. Now let's go F11. You divide that pizza by 11 pieces. Now you have a really small piece of pizza, right? So the bigger the number that you're dividing by, the smaller the final number that you're going to get. Okay. So yeah, with Aperture, it's a little bit inverted, the number. Okay. So your aperture affects your photos in 2 ways again, just like the other two. It affects your exposure, right? The bigger the aperture size, the more light you're going to have. The smaller the aperture size or the hole, the less light you're going to have. And then the second thing it's going to affect is your depth of field. Your depth of field just means what part of your image is in focus and what part of your image is blurry. Okay. So like in this photo, you see how the streets behind her is very blurred out. That's because I'm shooting with a shallow depth of field. Okay. So what's the relationship? So I'm going to talk about first the relationship between exposure and aperture. So like I said, when you have a low F number, your aperture is very large, like the actual aperture hole or size is very large, right? So you're going to let in lots of light and it's going to be bright. As you make your aperture number bigger, your aperture itself is going to get smaller, right? The hole is going to get smaller and it's going to get darker and darker. Okay. And again, when I did this, I was shooting in manual, and so shutter wasn't changing and ISO was not changing. Yeah. And then, like I said, it also affects your depth of field, right? So when you have a low aperture number, it's going to make the background more blurry. When you have a large aperture number, it's going to make the background more in focus. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's very blurred out. It's hard to see what's behind this can. But on the right-hand side, you can definitely see the power bar. It looks like there's a lens there, a little camera, and a few other things, right? You can kind of see what's in the background, right? But on the left-hand side, it's blurred out and it's hard to see. You don't know what it is, right? So a lot of photographers, especially when they're new to photography, one of the things they want to learn is, how do I make the background blurry? Well, here it is. You just have a low aperture number, right? That's the key. That's the secret. So when you're playing with low aperture numbers and playing around with your depth of field, you're not just making the background more blurry, you're also making the foreground more blurry. It actually goes both ways. Okay. So what happens is, when you're playing with your depth of field, meaning how much of your image is in focus and how much is blurred out, the depth of field starts at where you're focused on, okay? So in this case, I'm focusing on the couple, right? So that's where the depth of field starts. And then it starts to get blurry as you move away from your focal point, which is them, right? So then as you move away from these two subjects, which means towards if you get moved towards the background and towards the camera, it starts to get more blurry and more blurry. Okay. Yeah. So it's not just the background being more blurry, but also your foreground getting more blurry, meaning anything closer to the camera. So your depth of field, which is how much of your image is in focus and how much of it is blurry, is affected by more than just your aperture. Like we talked about how aperture affects depth of field, but there's also three other things that affects your depth of field. The lens that you're using, the larger the focal length, the more blurry the shallower your depth of field is going to be. Okay, meaning the more blurry your background and foreground is going to be. Okay, so for example, if you want to have if you're shooting with, if two people are shooting a subject and they're both shooting at the same aperture, so two people, one shooting at f8, the other one's also shooting at f8, but one's shooting with 50 millimeter lens, and another one's shooting at a 200 millimeter lens, and they have relatively the same composition, right? The one shooting with 200 millimeters will have a blurrier background than the person shooting at 50 millimeters. Okay, so the larger the focal length, the blurrier the background and foreground is going to be. And then the other two is distance between your subject to the background and distance from the camera to the subject. So the further the background is from the subject, the blurrier the background is going to be. And the closer you are to your subject, meaning the closer the camera is to the subject, the more blurry the background is going to be too. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to play around a little with depth of field, I believe. Let's see here. Yes, we're going to be playing around with depth of field. So again, find a random object around you, whatever it is, a cup, an object, a toy around you, whatever you got around you. And then I want you to set your camera to manual again. Set it to ISO 6400, aperture f8, and then shutter 1/30. Okay. And then I want you to make sure there's a lot of space between your subject and the background. Okay. When I say a lot of space, I mean at least 8 feet, I would say. You want 8 feet between your subject and the background. Okay. Around there anyway, around 8 feet. And then I want you to also make sure that when you're shooting the subject, your camera is level to the floor. Okay, so don't shoot like pointed down or anything. Put it straight, like shoot your subject straight on, like facing the front, obviously, right? So make sure it's level to the floor. And then I want you to take a photo, like I said, one at f8, and then you're gonna just take one at f3.5, and then another one at 1.8. If your camera doesn't do 1.8, that's okay. Maybe shoot at something in between, like 5.6 or something. Yeah. And then notice the difference between f8 and then whatever your lowest f number is. If it's 3.5, if it's 1.8, it depends on the lens and what you're shooting at. And then noticing when you're shooting at a lower f number, it gets more blurry. And when you're shooting at a higher f number, you can see more of the background. The background's more in focus. to do it. Nicola was able to do it. 786. Assuming that's your number. You can change it to your name if you want. I think the 3 dots, and then you can, so I don't have to call you 786. Olivia, mine only goes to 3.5. Yes. So most zoom lenses will only go down to 3.5. If you want to get the super blurry effect, which is like going down to at least 1.8, you want to buy something called a prime lens. Prime lens just means you can't zoom with it. It's a fixed focal length. A great starter prime lens is a 50 mil. And then after that, you can get a 35 or an 85. I would start with the 50. And the 50 isn't that expensive. It's between $100 to $200. Yeah. It'll just be weird because you're not used to not being able to zoom. And you might get annoyed initially. And then after a while, you're like, you get used to it. Because the way you zoom with a prime lens is by moving your feet and moving the camera closer or further away from the subject. So it's a bit more work, but it's worth it. Anyone else successful with this practice or this exercise? Or anyone needs help? Yes, there are zoom lenses that can go lower than 3.5, and they're pretty expensive, yes. I call them the wedding lenses, the 2.8. So it's the, I want to say 24 to 70 and then 70 to 200, 2.8. I've seen one that are also in the ones, like 1.8 or whatever, and they're also zoom lens. I think they're called art lenses or something like that, or the art series or something like that. Yeah. But you're pretty much paying at least $1,000 for me. Yeah. Yeah, if you have money to blow, go nuts. Does anyone else need more time for this exercise? Okay, if not, I'll move on. Okay, so now you have a kind of at least a good base understanding of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Okay, you got a good core understanding of what it is and how to manipulate it and what it does and everything. Now we need to learn how to put it together and kind of make it, work together basically for you to be able to shoot in manual. Okay. Okay, so let's do a quick review. ISO, it affects your image in 2 ways. Well, first, ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to light, and then it affects your image in 2 ways. One is exposure. If you crank up your ISO number, it will make it brighter. But then also when you crank up the ISO, it's going to make it noisier or more grainy, and you don't want that, right? So you keep your ISO as low as you can and only bump it up if you have to after you played around with aperture, played around with shutter, and it's still too dark. Then you bump up your ISO as the last thing you do. We talked about shutter speed. That's how fast or slow the shutter opens and closes, right? Or right? And again, that affects your exposure, right? If you have it open for a long period of time, it's going to be, your image is going to be brighter. Like if you're shooting at 1 second, Versus if you shoot a very fast shutter speed, like 1/250th of a second, then it's going to be really fast and you're not going to be able to let in a lot of light and it's going to be dark. And then it affects motion. So if you have something that's moving, like kids, dogs, wildlife, birds, sports, right? Hockey players, your kids are playing hockey or volleyball or whatever, track and field. You can either freeze motion with a very fast shutter speed, or you can blur motion, and that could be intentional. Maybe that's what you want to do. You can blur motion by having a long shutter speed, right? Or you're doing light painting. And then the last one is aperture. That's how big or small the size of the hole that you're shooting through, okay? So it affects exposure and affects depth of field. The smaller the F number, right? The larger the aperture size, the hole, right? The brighter your image is going to be. The larger the F number, the smaller your aperture hole, the darker your image is going to be. Also, if you're trying to manipulate depth of field, if you're doing landscape and you want everything in focus, you want to make sure you have a large F number, right? Like F11, F22. And if you want to blur out the background, let's say you're doing portraits or you're shooting an object and you don't want the background to be distracting, then you want to have a shallow depth of field. You shoot at a lower F number, right? Like F1.8, 3.5, 2.8. Okay, so let's put it all together. So I have it all in one sheet here, or one, all three, and with all the different values all on one sheet, so you can see it all. Okay, so you can kind of see all three and what it does as you go up or down the settings, right? If you make your F number large, it's going to be darker. The aperture size will be smaller, but everything's going to be in focus, or more of your image is going to be in focus. If you go the opposite direction to the right, make your F number smaller, you're going to have a larger aperture hole, right, or size, and you're going to have a shallow depth of field. Shutter speed, fast shutter speed, freeze motion, slow shutter speed, blur motion, low ISO number, darker image, but you're not going to have a lot of grain in your photo, right, or noise. As you crank up the ISO, it's going to be brighter, but also more noisy, okay? Okay, so let's come back to semi-auto before we go into manual. So baby steps. So now that you have an understanding of aperture, shutter, and ISO, we can now talk about semi-auto first, okay? So like I said, semi-auto, and I'm specifically going to talk about aperture priority and shutter priority, which is ANS or AVTV, okay? So aperture priority, A or AV, you get to control aperture and the camera will control shutter. If you're on S or TV, which is shutter speed, shutter priority, you control the shutter speed and it will control the aperture for you. So let's talk about what's actually happening on the sheet here, okay? So let's pretend your current camera setting is straight down the middle. So f8, 1/60, ISO 800. You take a photo and it's properly exposed and you're happy, right? It's like, okay, everything's properly exposed. I'm happy with this photo. But then you're like, I'm actually shooting landscape and I want everything in focus, right? I want the mountains in focus. I want the trees in focus. And I even want the person that's standing in, posing with the mountains in the background to be in focus. So I want a large depth of field. Okay, if I want a large depth of field, what do? I need to crank up my F number, right? My aperture number. So you crank it up to F16 and you're shooting in aperture priority right now, okay? So you're shooting in aperture priority. So you adjust it to F16. So what happens is the camera's like, oh, you're cranking up the aperture. It's getting darker. We need to adjust your camera settings to compensate for that so that you still have a properly exposed image, right? So the camera, because you're an aperture priority, which is semi-auto, it will automatically adjust your shutter and go down 2 steps. We call it 2 stops in photography, right? So it's gonna make it go 1/15. And now you still have a properly exposed image because you go 2 to the left and you're making it darker. Then the camera needs to go 2 to the right to make it brighter. And then now you're back at the original exposure, right? If you're on shutter priority because you're shooting sports, right? Actually, no, sorry. In this example, we're not shooting sports. We're trying to do long exposure. So you're shooting waterfalls. Okay. It's like, okay, I'm shooting waterfalls. And so I know if I'm shooting waterfalls, I need to have a slow shutter speed. So you're on shutter priority. You adjust it to 1/4 of a second or 1/4 of a second. So the camera is going to adjust the aperture for you, and it moves it to the left to make sure your exposure is, again, proper, and it sets it to f32 on its own. Okay, so that's actually what's happening when you're playing with semi-auto, either aperture priority or shutter priority. You change one, it will change the other for you, and vice versa. Okay. So let's see here. Okay? So this is practicing shooting in semi-auto. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with shooting in semi-auto. I actually, even though I'm a professional photographer and I do this as a living, there are still situations where it makes sense for me to shoot in shutter priority or aperture priority. I don't shoot in manual all the time. I only shoot in manual maybe 40%, maybe 50% of the time. Okay. Yeah. So for this example, I want you to set it to shutter priority. So that's either S or TV. I want you to set your ISO to 6400 and your shutter speed to 1/60. Okay. And then all I want you to do is I want you to adjust your shutter up and down, and you'll notice the aperture going up and down. Okay. And then once you've done that, play around with aperture priority. Okay. Start at f8 for aperture priority, and then go up and down with your aperture. And then you'll notice your shutter going up and down. Some cameras won't show you what the other number is, right? Like it will adjust it, but it won't actually give you a value, or it won't show you the value. But that's what it is actually doing. Yeah. And if you want to find out, you can take a photo and then look at the camera, then go into info to see what the settings were for that photo, basically. And you'll see like I said, either the aperture or the shutter going up and down. Let me know. And yeah, the way you adjust it is just by turning the dial. You turn the dial, either the front dial or the back dial. So for those that are curious, like, why don't I shoot in manual all the time, or what situation do I shoot in manual, and what time situations do I shoot in semi-auto, right? Manual is just too slow. And if you're shooting something that is happening and it's happening fast, like for example, event photography or weddings, right? Where things are happening and you don't have time to tell the bride, like, hold on for 2 seconds, let me adjust my settings and then walk down the aisle, right? You don't have that, right? So a lot of times for, especially for event photography, things are happening or moving. You need to be fast. And so the easier to be fast is to set to aperture priority or shutter priority. Or you're in a situation where the lighting is different in different areas of the room, right? Like one area is bright and one area is dark, right? Or there's lights moving around. Yes, to answer your question, Dana, yes, AV TV for Canon. Yeah, AV is aperture priority and TV is shutter priority. Yeah. And then when I shoot in manual is when I actually have control over a situation. So when I'm shooting studio lighting, like doing studio portraits, I often shoot in manual. And I have time to adjust things. Okay, so we have an extra question from one of our students. They're asking about back button focus, so a little bit unrelated to this. So the default way of taking a photo or pressing the shutter button is by pressing the shutter button, which is normally on the front, right? You press the shutter button, but also doubles up as a focus button, right? You press it halfway, it focuses, you push it all the way down, and then you take the photo. On most cameras, there's an option to move your focus button to the back of the camera. And you're making, usually it's the AEL, AFL button. You can change it to a focus button. And you do it through your menu, and you basically program that button to be the new focus button. And most pro photographers or experienced photographers will do this, including myself. I've done this. The reason why you do this is because now you don't have one button that does two things. You have one button that does one thing. So if you want to take a photo, you don't have to wait for it to focus and then shoot. So if you're a sports photographer or you're shooting events or you're shooting things that are happening and it's happening fast, you don't want to go press, focus, and then shoot, because by the time you focus and then you shoot, that thing is gone, right? Like whatever it is, dogs running around, kids running around, track and field, sports, right? So you want to pre-focus using a back button. And then when you're ready, you just press the shutter button to take the photo, just like that. So I hope that answers that question, Anna. Okay, so we're going to move on. I feel like everyone was able to do this exercise. Okay, so now we get to the good stuff, the stuff that you've been waiting for all this time. How to shoot in manual. Okay, so time to talk about shooting in manual. So when you're shooting in manual, you now have full control over aperture and shutter, okay? Shooting in manual doesn't mean you have full control over ISO actually, okay? Because with ISO, you can still have auto ISO in manual, okay? Manual just means you have full control over shutter and aperture. And then ISO, it depends on what you set it to. You can do auto ISO or you can do manual ISO, okay? So yeah, if you adjust your shutter, if you adjust your aperture, let's say you set it to f16, your shutter will stay as is, right? So if it's at 1/60, it'll stay at 1/60 until you change it, okay? If you decide to go to 1/250, right? Let's say, yeah, then you can adjust that and without affecting aperture. Okay, so when you're shooting in manual, the way you get proper exposure, or you figure out, okay, what should my setting be to get proper exposure? There's something called a meter, right? It's this little 0, 1, -1, 2, -2. You will either see it through your viewfinder. So if you look through your viewfinder, you'll see it. If you don't see it through your viewfinder, press your shutter button halfway. Then it will light up and you will see this little meter. If you have the back of the camera turned on with all the different settings, right? Then you also see it on the back of your camera too, like on the screen. Okay, so those are the two places where you see this meter. So if the meter is pointing to the left, it means your photo is underexposed. And you need to adjust your settings to make it brighter. If the meter is moving to the right, is pointed to the right, that means your image is going to be overexposed if you take the photo. And you need to adjust your settings to make it darker. Okay. So that's actually how you shoot in manual and get proper exposure fast without just like guessing and testing. Right? Like you take a photo, you see if it's dark or bright, and then you adjust, and then you keep adjusting until it's proper exposure. That's the wrong way to do it. The faster way is by looking at the meter. Okay. So yeah, so I want people to kind of find your meter and then play around with your settings and try to figure out how to get proper exposure. Adjust your shutter speed, adjust your aperture, even adjust your ISO if you need to get them and move that meter to the left, to the right, and to the center. Okay. And then take a sample photo. And if anybody has any questions or need help, let me know. Does anybody need more time? Okay, yeah, no worries, Olivia. It just comes with practice. The more you practice, the more you'll figure it out and kind of become second nature. When you're doing it for your first time, or just when you're relatively new, yeah, you kind of forget if what do I do to make it something brighter or darker. But yeah, the more you do something, the better you will be, and the more it'll be second nature. But yeah, it takes time. But also, when you're adjusting your settings, you can actually see the meter go up or down, right? So you can see, hey, it's actually making it darker. I need to go the other way, or whatever, right? Yeah. Unless you're at the end of the meter, then you're like way too dark or way too bright. Then yeah, you can't see the actual change. Yeah, if you can't move the scale, it just means you're way too dark or way too bright. That's what it means. Yeah. Like instead of you're at -2, you're actually at -4 or -6. So you're actually past the meter scale. Yeah, yeah. I'm assuming most people will be too dark. Okay. Especially when you're doing indoors. So you're gonna have to bump up your ISO, crank it up to like at least 3200, I would say, as a starting point. And then you can lower down your aperture number to make it brighter, or you can slow down your shutter speed to also make it brighter. Awesome. Olivia was able to figure it out. Dana, were you able to figure it out? Try it as a starting point. Try 3200 for ISO, f 3.5, and 1/60 for the shutter speed. Try that setting as a starting point. Did that work, Dana? Awesome. Cool. Okay. So yeah, we're gonna move on. Unless anyone else has any question, we're almost there. We're almost at the end. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is what should my settings be when I'm shooting in manual, right? for different situations, because you're going to run into different situations. You're going to be photographing outdoor when the sun is out, outdoor when the cloud, sunset, sunrise, sports, dogs, kids, cats, still life, portrait, landscape, birds, bears, whatever. You're going to run into a million situations, right? I'm like, what's my camera settings, right? I'm going to tell you a way to figure it out without having to memorize it for every single situation. There are actual books out there that says for sunset, this is what your setting should be as a starting point. For sunrise, for birds, for hockey, for sports, this is what your starting setting should be. You don't need to memorize that. Okay. I'm going to make it simple for you so that you can figure out what your settings need to be for any situation. Okay. Anyone. You just have to memorize these. What we're going to mention in the next second or two here. Okay, so you basically have to ask yourself one question. That's it, one question. And the question you need to ask yourself is, how fast is my subject moving? Okay, this is the golden question that will tell you what your setting needs to be. Okay, how fast is my subject moving? I don't mean exact like 100 kilometers an hour or 0 kilometers an hour or whatever. Just, is it moving fast or is it moving slow or not at all? That's kind of pretty much your three options: fast, slow, or not at all. And what I mean by slow is like around maybe walking speed. Okay. So once you answer that question, then you will know what your settings need to be. And I'll explain in a second. Okay, let's start with it's not moving at all or it's moving slow. Okay. If it's not moving at all because you're shooting still life, or it's moving slow, like they're not moving that fast, then what you need to do is step one, you adjust your aperture. And you adjust your aperture to whatever you want it to be. Okay. Meaning, if you want a blurry background, right, then you make sure your aperture is a low number. If you want to have a large depth of field because I want to show off the mountains or the trees or whatever in the background, then you have a large aperture number, right? So you have to figure out, okay, do I want a blurry background or do I want the background to be in focus? Then you adjust your aperture accordingly. After you've done that, you adjust your shutter speed, okay? And remember, when you're adjusting your shutter speed, you don't want to go too slow if you're shooting handheld. If you're doing handheld, remember 1/f is the slowest shutter speed you should set it to. Once you got those two, if the photo is too dark, then bump up your ISO or adjust your ISO as the last thing. But your ISO should always be 100 as a starting point, like the lowest, because you don't want noise, right? So your ISO should always be at 100. And then after you play with your aperture, play to your shutter, and you're happy, and it's still too dark, then you bump up your ISO. That's the last thing you do. Now, if you're shooting something that's moving fast, right? Sports, kids running around, dogs running around, birds flying, right? Cars driving by, right? You're shooting something fast. You do the opposite. You actually start with shutter speed first. And you adjust your shutter speed to whatever effect you want to create, right? If you want everything to be sharp and in focus, right, then you need to have a fast shutter speed, right? And the shutter speed will change depending on how fast that subject is moving, right? If you're photographing kids versus, track and field versus F1, race cars, your shutter speed to freeze that object is going to be different, right? So you just have to take a couple test shots to see what your shutter speed needs to be to freeze motion and have a sharp image. That's really the best way to figure out, is kind of do a couple test shots. If you're purposely trying to create a blur effect, then yes, you can slow down your shutter speed until you get the specific blur effect that you want. Like how much blur do you want actually, right? for the speed of the object that you're shooting. Okay. Once you're happy with your shutter speed, then you adjust your aperture, right? Do I care about the background being blurry, or do I want the background, or it doesn't matter to me, right? Because I'm just focused on the subject and not too worried about what's around it, if it's blurry or not. So second thing, you adjust your aperture and you play with it until you're happy with it and that you like the exposure. If you hit a wall and it's still too dark, then the last thing you do is you bump up your ISO again. Okay. And that's it. That's how you figure out your settings for whatever situation you're shooting. So I'll give an example. I'll give two examples. So let's pretend you're doing outdoor headshots. You're doing outdoor portraits, okay? So outdoor portrait, the subject is not really moving. They're standing there for you to take their photo, right? So it falls into the not moving fast category or not moving about category. So you want to start with aperture first. And because it's a portrait and it's a headshot, you want to create a blurry background. Let's say that's what you want to do. I want a blurry background. Okay, so how do I create a blurry background? I set my aperture to a low number. So let's pretend you set it to f2.8, okay, to create that blurry background effect. Okay, lock it in. Second thing is my shutter, right? So I'm going to set my shutter to 1/125 because I don't want motion blur from my hand shaking or moving, right? It's like, okay, I'm shooting with a 100mm lens, so I'm going to set it to 1/125, okay? And then ISO, I want it as low as I can as a starting point, right? So ISO 100. You take the photo and you realize the photo is too bright, right? Because you're outdoors, it's too bright. Okay, well, you know that your shutter speed, which is 1/125, is just a minimum, right? I can actually make it darker. So you move your shutter speed to go even faster to make it darker. And then you get a properly exposed image, you're happy, you're done. Okay. Let's now, second example, let's pretend you're shooting hockey, right? Your kids are playing hockey and you want to photograph them skating around and taking slap shots and whatever, right? And you want to freeze the motion of the puck going towards the net, right? And the goalie maybe making a save or something, right? You want to freeze that puck, but that puck moves really fast, right? So you need to have a fast shutter speed, right? You take a couple test photos and you realize to freeze that puck during a slap shot, you need it to be 1/500. Okay, so you leave it at 1/500 for your shutter speed because that's what you need to freeze that puck as it goes towards the goalie. Okay, next is aperture, right? You're not too worried about the background being blurry or not, right? So you leave it at f4 because you're shooting indoors and you're gonna need to kind of give the camera as much light as possible, okay? As much, crank up the exposure, right? So you leave it at f4. And then you leave your ISO at 100. But again, you take a test photo and you're indoors and it's dark. So you already kind of maxed out. You can't make it brighter by moving down, like making your apertures smaller because your lens maxes out at f4. It doesn't have 2.8, it doesn't have 1.4, it doesn't have 2. So the only way you can make it brighter is by cranking up your ISO. So you crank up your ISO to 800. Okay, so congratulations. You all have learned how to shoot in manual. At least have a good foundation. So yeah, congratulations. You've made it. You've done it. Everyone, round of congratulations already. Round of applause. You graduated. So yeah, hope you enjoy that. That was the end of this class.